Chapter 9. The Vandal. Indignant, Nancy shook herself loose from Vince Driscoll's grasp. At that moment, his sister-in-law came from the same room and glared at him. "Carl and I gave Miss Drew and her friends permission to come here and hunt for an iron bird," she said coldly. "Why didn't you tell me?" Vince asked sullenly. "I'd have warned you not to. She's snoopy and a troublemaker." He turned to Nancy. "Don't show up here again." Mrs. Driscoll set her jaw firmly. "That's for Carl to decide, not you." Vince seemed about to retort, but instead kept still and stalked on down the hall. Nancy then told Mrs. Driscoll about having been locked out. The woman said, "Vince didn't know you were here and went up to the attic. That door to the roof is not supposed to be open, so he locked it. After a while, I went up to see why you'd been there so long and found out what had happened. Since you weren't on the balcony, I assumed you were somewhere on the roof and unlocked the door." "I appreciate that," said Nancy. "I could just picture myself staying out there all night." She decided to make light of the matter and pretend that she accepted the explanation without question, but she was very suspicious. Suddenly she thought of the closed-up room with the bullseye window. Had the Driscolls locked her out deliberately because they themselves had been keeping something or someone hidden in it? "And maybe moved out the person or object while I was outside," Nancy concluded. "It could even have been the red-haired girl. But what's the reason?" Mrs. Driscoll escorted Nancy to the front door and said goodbye pleasantly. "It's too bad the bird in the storage room isn't the one you're looking for," she said. "If we happen to come across another, we'll let you know." "Thank you," Nancy said, and started down the road. The Driscoll family puzzled her. She wondered about the brothers' maintenance business. They seem to be home a lot, Nancy thought. Well, maybe they don't get many calls. In any case, they certainly did not seem to get along well together. Could it be because of the twins? Nancy reflected. But why? She vividly recalled the hard look Carl Driscoll had given her in the general store. She was sure he was not pleased that the girls were living at the lake. Though why did he go out of his way to be helpful? When Nancy reached the cottage, the three girls came out to meet her, and she reported her adventure. Bess was concerned. "Why, Nancy, you might have slipped off that road and been killed." Nancy grinned. "I guess I'm just a tough old sleuth." "It's a good thing, because you're in for a surprise," George stated. "Wait until you see this cottage." As Nancy walked inside, she stared aghast at the scene before her. Tables and chairs had been broken. Every drawer in the place had been emptied of its contents, which were scattered around the floor. Bess had endeavored to put some of the things away before picking up the other two girls. The three had just started working again when Nancy arrived. "It's vandalism," Cecily said to Nancy. "Oh, who would want to do such a thing?" "So far," said Bess, "we haven't found anything missing." George nodded. "Some intruders are like that. They get so angry if they can't find what they're looking for, they'll tear a place to pieces." The girls went on straightening up and repairing the furniture as best they could. As they worked, George and Cecily reported that they had gone to Neil Raskin's office, but he was not there. No one seemed to know where he had gone or when he would return. Suddenly Bess said, "I'm starved. Do you realize it's 7 o'clock? I never did start supper, what with this mess." The girls stopped working, and by 7:30 were seated around the little table, eating hungrily and chatting over the day's adventures. "They all seem to add up to nothing," said Cecily, a sad expression in her eyes. To cheer her, Nancy suggested taking a ride in the canoe. Cecily eagerly accepted. "You two go," said George. "Bess and I will do the dishes." Nancy and Cecily each took a paddle, and without even consulting each other, they found themselves heading for Puddingstone Lodge. By this time it was late dusk, and a mist had begun to rise up from the water. In the foggy area it was thicker than ever. "We'd better stay away from there," said Cecily. "We might get lost." Puddingstone Lodge was well lighted, and Nancy wondered what was going on inside the house. Suddenly, the strange humming noise came to the girl's ears. As before, its source was elusive, seeming to be outdoors and yet muffled enough to be inside. "It might be some sort of generator in the house," said Nancy, "but I shouldn't think we'd notice it from here." The two girls listened intently, but still could not figure out the exact location of the sound. Cecily showed signs of apprehension. "We're pretty close to the place where that phantom boat appeared," she told Nancy. "Just in case there's something dangerous about it, don't you think we should leave?" Personally, Nancy would have liked to stay, but out of consideration for Cecily, she agreed. They turned the canoe around and began to paddle back toward the cottage. Nancy kept looking over her shoulder, hoping the apparition would appear. Cecily, on the other hand, was wishing just as hard that it would not. The lake remained dark. When they reached the cottage dock, Nancy glanced up. She glimpsed a man's shadowy figure moving off among the trees around the cabin. "The prowler," Nancy thought. She leaped from the canoe and made a wild dash after the man, but he began running too. There was enough light from the cottage and the rising moon to help Nancy keep track of the fleeing man, but he had too much of a head start, and soon she lost sight of him completely. "He certainly acted guilty," Nancy told herself. Cecily had beached the canoe and was carrying the paddles to the cottage. Nancy met her. "What in the world made you dash off?" Cecily asked. When Nancy explained, Cecily's eyelids flickered worriedly. She was silent as the two girls went inside. Nancy told Bess and George of her fruitless chase. Cecily kept clasping and unclasping her hands nervously. Nancy was about to try reassuring her when suddenly Satin aroused from a half-sleeping posture, arched his back, and stared into the next room, which was dark. "What does he see?" Bess whispered. Without warning, the cat shot into the room. There was a slight squeak, and in a few seconds, Satin emerged triumphantly, a mouse in his mouth. He placed it at Bess's feet. "Oh, how horrible!" Bess cried out. "Take that thing away!" Satin, as if he understood, carried the mouse back into the dark room. Unexpectedly, Cecily smiled. "He's having himself a feast, I suppose." George said, "I wish Satin had pounced on that Vandal and sunk his teeth into the fellow." The girls laughed, then Cecily lapsed into her unhappy mood. A few minutes later, she arose. "I just can't stand not seeing or talking to Nico any longer. If you'll drive me to town, I'll catch the late bus for Baltimore, and maybe see the last part of his performance." She consulted her watch and discovered that it would be nip and tuck as to whether she could make the bus in time. Nancy agreed to try. As Cecily tossed a few things into her suitcase, Bess and George declared that Nancy should not go alone. "Your father wouldn't like it one bit," said George. "We're going with you," Bess insisted. "Vandal or no Vandal." Nancy hugged the cousins. "I'm sure it isn't necessary, but I love you both for it." Cecily just managed to make the bus, and everyone heaved a sigh of relief. Next, Nancy drove to the local police headquarters and went inside. Chief Stovall, a friendly, husky man, was on duty. She introduced herself and gave a quick report on the cottage entry. The chief listened attentively. "We have a very limited force here, Miss Drew," he said, "but we'll do our best to nab the prowler. Offhand, I can't think of anyone I'd suspect among our villagers." Nancy's thoughts flashed to the Driscolls, but she had no proof of her suspicions about them, and said nothing. She mentioned having seen the Phantom launch. Chief Stovall grinned. "I've heard those reports, and I certainly don't disbelieve you, Miss Drew. I've been out to the lake several evenings for that purpose, but until I see it for myself, there is nothing I can do." "I understand," Nancy smiled and said good night. She, Bess, and George returned to the cottage, wondering in what kind of condition they would find it. Fortunately, no one had broken in, and the three friends settled down to read and write letters. Satin, too, had curled up by the fire, which was now burning brightly. But suddenly he stood up and stared at the outside door. George grinned. Bess, maybe he's going to get you another mouse. But her grin faded as the silence outside was broken. The girls heard the porch step creak. End of chapter 9.